The first time my HOA president told me I had to change my backyard or cancel my wedding plans, I honestly thought there had to be some kind of misunderstanding. I was standing at my front door holding a letter that looked more like a legal warning than a neighborhood complaint, listening to a man explain that my plants were somehow a threat to the community. My wedding was only days away. My family had already made travel arrangements, and the woman I loved was counting down the hours until we could finally celebrate together. Yet somehow the biggest problem in my neighborhood wasn't a broken fence, a safety issue, or a damaged property. It was my cactus. What Marcus Bell didn't understand was that he wasn't just fighting a homeowner who wanted a different yard. He was challenging someone who knew exactly how things worked beneath the surface, and sometimes the things hidden underground are far more powerful than the rules written on paper. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 36 years old, and I'm a civil engineer living in a desert community outside Mesa, Arizona. For most of my career, I've worked with infrastructure, land development, and utility systems. I spend my days looking at blueprints, reviewing construction plans, and figuring out how everything connects. Most people see a finished neighborhood and think about the houses, the driveways, and the landscaping. I see the things nobody notices. The pipes underneath the streets, the drainage paths after a storm, the property lines that decide who has rights and who doesn't. I've always believed that every structure has a story, and if you look closely enough, the truth is usually hidden somewhere below the surface. When Claire and I first moved into Desert Willow Estates, we thought we had found the perfect place to start our lives together. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked like it came straight from a brochure. 47 homes, all built with the same beige stucco walls, the same tile roofs, the same carefully maintained front lawns. From the outside, everything looked peaceful and organized. But after living there for a while, I started noticing something strange. We were in the middle of Arizona, where summer temperatures could easily climb past 110 degrees, but every house was trying to maintain a bright green lawn that belonged somewhere with completely different weather. Every morning before sunrise, the sprinklers would activate across the neighborhood. You could hear the clicking of timers, the rush of water, and the constant effort required to keep those lawns alive. It wasn't just a little maintenance. Those yards consumed thousands of gallons every month. I never understood why everyone was fighting against the environment instead of working with it. So when Claire and I bought our home, I decided to do something different. I removed the traditional grass and designed a desert landscape that actually matched where we lived. I planted native trees, added barrel cactus, drought-resistant flowers, and natural stone paths. Instead of spending every week trying to keep grass alive, I created a yard that could survive on its own. To me, it wasn't just landscaping, it was common sense. My neighbors had lawns that needed constant watering. Mine needed a fraction of that, and honestly, I loved it. There was something peaceful about sitting outside in the morning with coffee while birds moved through the native plants. In the evening, when the Arizona sun dropped behind the mountains, my yard would glow with warm colors that changed every few minutes. It didn't look like every other house on the street, and that was exactly why it felt special. Most of my neighbors agreed. Some would stop while walking by and ask what plants I used. A few told me they wished they could replace their lawns too, but were afraid of HOA complaints. That was when I started realizing my yard wasn't really the problem. The problem was that it represented a choice, and choices were something Marcus Bell did not like. Marcus was the president of our HOA, and he treated that position like he had been given authority over everything within the neighborhood. He always carried a clipboard. He always seemed to be inspecting something. He walked around the community looking for violations the way some people look for lost money. The first time he came to my house, he didn't even introduce himself properly. He stood at the edge of my driveway, looked across my yard, and stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then he finally said, "You know this isn't really consistent with the neighborhood style, right?" I thought he was joking, so I smiled and replied, "I know. That's why I like it." He didn't laugh. He looked at the cactus near my walkway and then back at me. "People buy homes here because they expect a certain appearance." I said, "I understand that, but I'm not breaking any rules. The landscaping follows city guidelines, and it actually saves water." Marcus nodded slowly, but it wasn't the kind of nod someone gives when they understand. It was the kind of nod someone gives when they're already planning their response. Then he said something I still remember. "Saving water isn't the only thing that matters." That sentence told me everything, because he wasn't talking about safety. He wasn't talking about property damage. He was talking about control. A few days later, The first violation notice arrived. The wording was carefully written to sound official. It mentioned community appearance, visual consistency, and neighborhood harmony. But when you stripped away all the fancy words, the message was simple. They didn't like that my house looked different. Then came the fines, $200 every month. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table when we opened the first notice together. She read it twice, looked at me, and said, "Wait, they're charging you because your plants don't match their plants?" I laughed because it sounded ridiculous when she said it out loud, but I also knew something important. These situations rarely start with one huge battle. They start small, a warning, a fee, a reminder, someone testing how far they can push before someone pushes back. So, I didn't yell at Marcus. I didn't create a scene. I simply started documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every payment, every conversation. I created a folder on my computer and kept printed copies in my office. Claire used to tease me about it. One night, she walked into my office, looked at the stack of HOA documents, and said, "Should I be worried that you have enough paperwork to make a documentary?" I laughed and told her, "Hopefully not." At that time, I honestly believed the situation would eventually disappear. I thought Marcus would realize he couldn't force me to change something legal just because he personally disliked it. I thought reason would win, but I was wrong, because Marcus wasn't upset about my landscaping anymore. He was upset because I refused to let him decide everything for me. Then Claire and I got engaged, and my backyard became more than just a landscaping project. It became the place where we wanted to begin our marriage. We planned a small wedding with 75 guests, warm lights hanging between the trees, a simple wooden arch, family, friends, and the desert landscape I had spent years creating as the backdrop. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about having a place that felt like us. And that was exactly when Marcus decided to make his biggest move, because the thing he hated most had become the center of the happiest moment of my life. 2 weeks before the wedding, Marcus arrived at my door with another board member behind him. He wasn't there to talk. He was there to deliver a decision. He handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Official HOA notice." I opened it right there. 3 pages, certified, formal, almost dramatic enough to make me laugh. But then I started reading. The HOA claimed my yard created an inappropriate visual environment for a private event. They said my landscaping could negatively affect neighborhood appearance and wedding photographs. Then I reached the final demand. I had to remove my entire desert landscape and replace it with approved grass before the ceremony. The estimated cost was nearly $9,000. If I refused, daily penalties would begin on my wedding day. I looked up at Marcus and asked, "Are you seriously telling me I have to change my yard because you don't like how my wedding pictures might look?" He adjusted his clipboard and calmly replied, "Rules exist for a reason, Ethan." And standing there in my driveway, I finally understood something. This was never about grass. It was never about appearance. It was about power. Marcus didn't want my yard changed because it was ugly. He wanted it changed because it proved someone could make their own decision without asking permission. What he didn't know was that while he was focused on what was growing above the ground, I had already started investigating what was hidden underneath it, and what I discovered there would completely change everything. The strange thing about people like Marcus is that they usually believe they are powerful because everyone around them chooses not to fight. They confuse silence with agreement. They mistake patience for weakness. And for a while, I think that was exactly what happened in Desert Willow Estates. People complained quietly. Neighbors rolled their eyes behind closed doors. But nobody wanted the headache of going against the HOA. Most people just paid the fees, followed the rules, and moved on with their lives. But I was different. Not because I enjoyed conflict. Honestly, I hated conflict. I would have preferred to spend my evenings planning my wedding, working on my projects, and enjoying my backyard instead of reading HOA regulations. But there was something about being told that I didn't have control over my own property that bothered me more than the fines themselves. So after Marcus delivered that final notice, I didn't immediately respond. I didn't send an angry email. I didn't walk into the HOA office and start yelling. I did what I always did when something didn't make sense. I started investigating. That night, after Claire went to bed, I sat at my desk and pulled up every document I had about the property. I looked through the HOA rules, the neighborhood plans, city records, and the original construction documents. At first, I was only looking for information about landscaping restrictions. I wanted to know exactly where Marcus got the authority to threaten me over a wedding. But then I noticed something strange. There was a section in the original infrastructure plans that didn't match what I knew about the property. A utility line appeared to run directly across my lot. Not near my property, not along the edge, directly through it. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. I thought maybe it was just an old drawing mistake. Construction documents are not always perfect. Sometimes plans change during building. Sometimes things get moved and paperwork doesn't catch up. But something about it bothered me. So the next morning, I started digging deeper. I contacted the county records office and requested archived documents from when Desert Willow Estates was built. I pulled old surveys. I reviewed contractor records. I looked at every easement agreement connected to the neighborhood, and that's when I found the first crack in Marcus's perfect little world. The main irrigation line supplying water to the HOA sprinklers crossed through my property. Not a small pipe, not some forgotten connection. The primary irrigation line that fed almost every lawn in the community. It had been installed years before I bought the house, back in 2003, when the neighborhood was originally developed. But there was one problem. There was no recorded easement, no legal agreement giving the HOA permission to use my land, no document showing they had the right to maintain, access, or operate that line. They had been using my property as part of their water system for more than 20 years without official permission. I remember sitting there in my office, reading the documents again and again, because part of me couldn't believe it. This wasn't some minor paperwork mistake. This was the kind of mistake that could completely change the situation. The same HOA that had been fining me for not following their rules had been depending on something they didn't legally control. And suddenly, the irony was impossible to ignore. Marcus spent months telling me my yard didn't belong in the neighborhood, while the entire neighborhood depended on something running underneath my yard. I called my friend Daniel, who was another engineer I had worked with before, and asked him to look over the documents. After reading through everything, he called me back and said, "Ethan, do you realize what you have here?" I said, "I have a pipe problem." He laughed. "No, you have leverage." That word stayed with me. Leverage. Because I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone's home. I just wanted Marcus to understand that ownership meant something. Rules meant something. Agreements meant something. You couldn't spend years controlling people while ignoring the same standards when they applied to you. Still, I didn't want to make a reckless decision. I knew turning off water to an entire neighborhood wasn't something you did casually. There were families living there, children playing outside, elderly neighbors who had nothing to do with Marcus's behavior. So I contacted an attorney, reviewed my options, and made sure I understood exactly what my rights were. My attorney, Laura Bennett, looked over the documents and told me something I'll never forget. "Ethan, the strongest position you have is that you don't need to act angry. The facts already speak for themselves." That was exactly what I needed to hear, because deep down, I knew this wasn't about winning a fight. It was about proving a point. A few days passed, and Marcus continued acting like nothing had changed. He sent another message reminding me about the landscaping deadline. He even included a note saying the HOA expected full cooperation. I remember reading that line and almost laughing. Full cooperation. That was how he described obedience. The funny thing was, he had no idea I was already preparing the one thing he couldn't control. The wedding week arrived. The weather was brutal. 98 degrees on Friday morning, with the kind of dry heat that makes everything outside feel exhausted. My yard looked beautiful. The plants were healthy. The flowers were blooming. The stone pathways were exactly how Claire and I imagined them. Meanwhile, Latchok, every other yard in the neighborhood, was completely dependent on the irrigation system running perfectly. That Friday morning, before the wedding, I walked behind my shed with the documents still fresh in my mind. Hidden beneath the ground was the access point I had confirmed through the records. 18 inches below the surface sat an old cast-iron valve connected to the main irrigation line. I stood there for a moment, just looking at it. I thought about how many years that pipe had been running through my property. I thought about every $200 fine I had paid, every warning letter, every time Marcus looked at me like I was the problem. Then I thought about Claire, about our wedding, and about how close this man had come to ruining something we would remember forever. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt calm. There's a difference. Anger makes people act without thinking. Calm makes people choose carefully. I reached down, placed my hand on the valve, and slowly turned it clockwise. Once, twice, 3 times. At first, nothing happened. Then I heard it, the sound of water pressure changing beneath the ground. Across the neighborhood, sprinklers began their normal cycle. But instead of spraying water, they coughed. They sputtered. Then they stopped. I stood there quietly for a few seconds, not celebrating, not cheering, just listening. Because for the first time in years, Marcus Bell and the HOA had to face something they never expected, a situation where they were not the ones holding all the power. And the timing couldn't have been worse for them, because the next morning was my wedding day. The morning after my wedding, I woke up early and stepped outside with a cup of coffee, expecting to feel exhausted. But instead I felt calm. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about HOA notices, fines, or Marcus Bell standing in my driveway telling me what I could and couldn't do. I was just looking at the place where Claire and I had started our marriage. The desert plants were still standing tall, the flowers were blooming, and the yard they called a problem looked exactly the way we wanted it to look. But across the street, things were changing quickly. The neighborhood lawns that depended on the HOA irrigation system were starting to turn yellow under the Arizona heat. At first, nobody panicked. A few dry spots didn't seem like a big deal. But by the end of the day, everyone could see something was wrong. Sprinklers turned on, motors ran, but no water came out. Marcus finally showed up at my door, angry and demanding answers. "What did you do, Ethan?" he asked. For once, he didn't sound like someone in control. He sounded like someone who had lost it. I calmly brought out the folder I had been building for months. The surveys, the construction records, the missing easement documents. I placed everything in front of him and said, "You spent months telling me the HOA controlled my property, but the truth is your entire irrigation system has been depending on my property." Marcus looked through the papers, and I watched the confidence disappear from his face. This wasn't about a yard anymore. It wasn't about wedding pictures. It was about a simple fact. The rules he enforced on everyone else were the same rules he had ignored himself. The HOA called an emergency meeting that evening. Suddenly, the same people who ignored my complaints were asking how this happened. Neighbors wanted answers. Board members wanted solutions. Marcus tried to argue that I was hurting the community, but nobody could ignore the documents sitting on the table. After hours of discussion, the HOA agreed to a new arrangement. They would pay for the unauthorized use of my land, remove the landscaping restrictions that targeted me, reimburse the fines I had paid, and rewrite the rules so homeowners could make reasonable choices without being punished. Marcus called it unfair. He called it a personal attack. But the truth was much simpler. He had spent years believing power came from controlling other people, and he finally learned that real authority comes from respecting boundaries. A few days later, Marcus resigned from the HOA board. I turned the water back on, and the neighborhood slowly recovered, but my desert yard stayed exactly the same. The cactus kept growing. The native plants kept blooming. They never needed permission to belong there. Looking back, I don't think this story was really about grass or water. It was about what happens when someone forgets that a community is built on respect, not control. Rules can protect people, but they can also become dangerous when the people enforcing them believe they are above everyone else. So I want to ask you, if you were in my position, would you have turned off the water? Or would you have found another way to fight back? Was I protecting my property, or did I take things too far? Let me know what you think in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and share your opinion about who was right in this situation.